A lone bobcat, injured and vulnerable, limps through a snow-covered wilderness. Weak from hunger and the pain of a deep gash on its hind leg, it struggles to stay upright as the bitter cold gnaws at its body. The howls of wolves echo in the distance, growing closer with every passing moment. Alone, surrounded, and on the brink of collapse, the bobcat prepares to face its fate. But just as the wolves emerge from the shadows, something unexpected happens, something that will test the limits of survival and redefine the bond between nature's fiercest creatures. Stay with us for a story of resilience, instinct, and a fight for freedom in the untamed wild. The forest lay blanketed in silence, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the frost-coated pines. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a slate-gray sky, settling into the thick white layer that covered the ground. Somewhere deep within this frozen expanse, the faint shuffle of movement betrayed the presence of life. A bobcat, its golden fur streaked with dirt and dried blood, dragged itself forward with labored steps. Its sleek body, once built for powerful leaps and swift pursuits, now quivered with exhaustion. Every step was a struggle. Its right hind leg dragged awkwardly behind, the wound, a raw, angry gash, still fresh from its escape from a hunter's steel trap. The metallic scent of blood lingered in the cold air, a silent beacon to predators lurking nearby. The bobcat's ears swiveled, its sharp gaze darting across the forest for signs of danger, but its strength was failing fast. Each shallow breath misted in the icy air, evidence of its waning energy. The first howl pierced the stillness, a haunting sound that sent a ripple of tension through the wilderness. The bobcat froze, its muscles tensing as its sharp ears tracked the direction of the noise. A second howl followed, closer this time, the cry of a pack closing in on an easy meal. The bobcat's heart pounded as it strained to move faster, leaving behind a faint trail of blood in the snow. It knew what the howls meant. Wolves did not miss such opportunities, especially in the dead of winter when food was scarce. Ahead, a frozen creek glimmered faintly in the fading light of dusk. The bobcat stumbled toward it, its paws crunching through the icy crust of snow. Reaching the edge, it collapsed onto the ground, its chest heaving as it fought to catch its breath. The bitter cold seeped into its body, but there was no time to rest. The howls were closer now, their eerie harmony sending shivers down the bobcat's spine. The wolves appeared like ghosts among the trees, their forms slipping through the shadows with a terrifying grace. The lead wolf, a large gray with piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward, its breath puffing in white clouds. Behind it, the pack spread out, their glowing eyes reflecting the dim light as they encircled the injured bobcat. The bobcat tried to rise, its claws digging into the frozen ground, but its body betrayed it. Its injured leg gave out, sending it back to the snow with a soft thud. The wolves crept closer, their low growls rumbling like distant thunder. The bobcat hissed weakly, baring its teeth in a futile display of defiance. It knew there was no escape. Alone, outnumbered, and too weak to fight, the predator had become prey. The lead wolf crouched, muscles coiling as it prepared to lunge. The bobcat closed its eyes, bracing for the end. But just as the wolf sprang forward, a sudden sound shattered the tension. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable report of a rifle. The lead wolf skidded to a halt, its ears swiveling as the pack paused in confusion. Another crack followed, this time accompanied by a flash of movement in the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in a heavy coat and carrying a rifle. The man's boots crunched against the snow as he raised the weapon, firing another warning shot into the air. The wolves growled, reluctant to abandon their prize, but the sight of the armed human was enough to break their resolve. One by one, they retreated into the trees, their glowing eyes disappearing into the darkness. The bobcat lay motionless, too weak to comprehend what had just happened. The man approached cautiously, lowering his rifle as he studied the injured animal. His face was weathered, his gray beard dusted with frost, and his sharp eyes betrayed a life spent in the unforgiving wild. He crouched beside the bobcat, his gloved hand reaching out slowly. "Well, aren't you a sorry sight?" he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. The bobcat flinched at his touch, but it lacked the strength to resist. The man carefully examined its wounds, shaking his head as he muttered to himself. "Caught in a trap, were you? Lucky you made it this far." With surprising gentleness, he removed his coat and wrapped it around the trembling animal. The bobcat's golden eyes flickered open, meeting his for a brief moment before exhaustion overtook it again. The man stood, cradling the injured creature in his arms. "This forest isn't kind to the weak," he said softly. more to himself than to the bobcat. "But maybe you've got a bit of fight left in you." The forest seemed to hold its breath as the man carried the bobcat away from the frozen creek, his figure vanishing into the shadows of the trees. The wolves now scattered, watched from a distance, their hunger unsatisfied. For the bobcat, the fight for survival was far from over, but for now, it had been given a second chance in a world that rarely offered mercy. The forest lay cloaked in heavy shadows as the man trudged through the snow, the injured bobcat cradled carefully in his arms. His breath rose in visible puffs, mingling with the frosty air, while the snow beneath his boots crunched with each deliberate step. The weight of the creature was lighter than he expected, a stark reminder of how frail it had become. Still, its chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, proof that life lingered within it, however fragile. The man's cabin was a modest structure nestled deep in the wilderness, its wooden frame blending seamlessly with the towering pines that surrounded it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a beacon of warmth in the otherwise unforgiving cold. As he approached, the man's sharp eyes darted to the tree line. He knew the wolves would not stray far. Hunger would drive them to linger, waiting for an opportune moment. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but functional, a rough wooden table, a cast-iron stove radiating warmth, and a cot pushed against the wall. The man lowered the bobcat onto a patchwork blanket near the fire, stepping back to assess the animal under the flickering orange glow. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and the wound on its hind leg oozed a dark, sluggish trail. The man removed his gloves, his calloused fingers working swiftly to retrieve supplies from a nearby shelf. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered, pouring warm water into a tin basin. His voice was low, almost gruff, but there was an undercurrent of something gentler, an unspoken understanding between one survivor and another. As he cleaned the wound, the bobcat stirred weakly, its ears flicking in response to the sharp sting. The man paused, his hand hovering over the creature. "Easy now," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bobcat's golden eyes opened briefly, glinting with fear and defiance before fluttering shut once more. The man worked methodically, cleaning away the dirt and blood, before applying a salve made from herbs he had foraged in the summer. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, honed by years of tending to his own injuries and those of the occasional animal he found in the wild. When the wound was bandaged, he stepped back, studying the bobcat's still form. "That's all I can do for now," he said quietly, as if the animal could understand him. "The rest is up to you." The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The man pulled up a chair and sank into it, his rifle leaning against the table within arm's reach. Outside, the faint howls of wolves echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder of how close death had been. He reached for a tin cup, pouring himself a measure of black coffee from the pot on the stove. His gaze lingered on the bobcat, its sides rising and falling with each shallow breath. As he sipped the bitter liquid, his thoughts drifted to the moment he had found it. The forest had been unusually quiet that evening, the air heavy with a tension he couldn't quite place. He had been tracking a small herd of deer when he stumbled upon the trail of blood. At first he thought it was the work of a predator, wolves or maybe a bear, but the unmistakable drag marks told a different story. He followed the trail to a frozen creek, where the bobcat had collapsed, its body trembling with exhaustion. The wolves had been closing in, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of dusk. He had acted on instinct, firing his rifle to scatter the pack. It wasn't the first time he had saved an animal in distress, but something about the bobcat had compelled him to act. Perhaps it was the defiance in its gaze, or the sheer will to survive despite its injuries. The man leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire seeping into his bones. "You've got fight in you," he said softly, almost to himself. "More than most I've seen." The bobcat stirred slightly, its tail twitching as it shifted on the blanket. The man took this as a good sign, though he knew the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time. He set down his cup and reached for the rifle, his eyes narrowing as he stared out the small window. "They'll be back," he muttered, more to himself than the bobcat. "They always come back." The cabin fell into an uneasy quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of wind against the wooden walls. The man kept watch through the night, his rifle resting across his lap. The bobcat's breathing grew steadier, its body still but no longer trembling. As the hours passed, a strange sense of calm settled over the room, as if the presence of the wild creature had brought a piece of the untamed forest into the man's solitary refuge. Morning arrived with a pale light filtering through the frost-covered window. The man rose from his chair, his back stiff from sitting for so long. He approached the bobcat cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. It opened one eye, watching him warily, but without the desperation of the night before. "You're tougher than you look," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe you'll make it after all." The bobcat didn't move, but its gaze lingered on the man for a moment longer than he expected. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes, a fragile truce between two survivors in a world that offered little kindness. For now, the wolves were at bay, and the bobcat had found shelter. But both the man and the animal knew that peace in the wilderness was fleeting. The true test of survival was yet to come. The cabin's warmth clashed against the bitter cold of the wilderness beyond its wooden walls. Inside, the bobcat lay on the patchwork blanket, its breathing steady but shallow. The man moved quietly around the room, his wiry frame bent over his routine. He boiled water on the cast-iron stove, his hands deftly grinding a mix of herbs to create another salve for the animal's wounds. His sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward the injured creature, gauging its progress. The bobcat, though still weak, was more alert than the day before. Its golden eyes followed the man's movements, a flicker of instinctive wariness in their depths. It didn't flinch as he approached, a bowl of water in one hand and a small strip of dried meat in the other. Instead, its ears twitched, and its nose quivered, catching the faint scent of food. The man crouched a few feet away, setting the offerings on the floor. "I reckon you've got some hunger in you," he said quietly. He stepped back, giving the bobcat space. The animal hesitated, its gaze darting between the food and the man. Hunger eventually won. With a shaky movement, it stretched its neck forward, lapping at the water, before cautiously taking the dried meat between its teeth. "That's it," the man murmured, his voice low and calm. He watched as the bobcat chewed slowly, its body trembling from the effort. The sight of the creature's resilience brought a rare softness to his rugged features. "You've still got some fight in you!" Outside, the forest remained eerily quiet. The wolves had not returned in the daylight, but the man knew better than to let his guard down. He had seen their tracks in the snow that morning, circling the edges of the clearing. They were waiting, biding their time until nightfall. The man spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin. He secured the shutters, checked the traps he had set around the perimeter, and ensured his rifle was loaded. The bobcat watched him from its spot near the fire, its golden eyes unblinking. There was a silent understanding between them now, two creatures bound by survival in a world that showed no mercy. By evening, the forest began to stir. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The man returned to the cabin, his boots stomping off the frost before stepping inside. He glanced at the bobcat, which had shifted its position but remained on the blanket. The animal's ears swiveled toward the faint howls echoing through the trees, a sound that made the man's jaw tighten. "They're testing us," he muttered, setting his rifle by the door. He crouched by the fire, adding another log to the flames. The warmth spread quickly, a small comfort against the encroaching night. The bobcat lifted its head slightly, its gaze fixed on the man. For the first time, there was something other than fear in its eyes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the man recognized it. Trust. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" he said softly, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "The wild doesn't give second chances often, but you're still here. That counts for something." The firelight danced across the cabin walls as the man leaned back, resting his elbows on his knees. He spoke to the bobcat as if it could understand, his voice a quiet rhythm in the otherwise silent room. He told it about the harsh winters he'd survived, the battles he'd fought against predators and nature alike. His words weren't meant to comfort. It was just the kind of truth the wilderness demanded. The bobcat watched him closely, its tail flicking once before curling around its body. As the man's voice trailed off, the howls outside grew louder, closer. The wolves had returned, and this time, they were not just passing through. The man stood, his expression hardening. He grabbed his rifle, checking the chamber before moving toward the window. The faint glow of moonlight illuminated the clearing, revealing the shadows of wolves moving between the trees. Their glowing eyes reflected the cabin's firelight, a reminder of the danger just beyond the threshold. "They're not giving up easy," he muttered, his grip tightening on the rifle. He glanced back at the bobcat, which had risen to a crouch, its body tense despite its injuries. The sight of the animal's defiance brought a flicker of determination to the man's gaze. "They won't take us tonight," he said firmly, more to himself than the bobcat. The hours dragged on as the wolves circled the cabin, their growls and howls filling the night air. The man stood guard, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. The bobcat remained near the fire, its ears twitching at every sound. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Neither would survive alone. Near midnight, the first wolf stepped into the clearing. It was the alpha, its massive frame silhouetted against the snow. The pack followed, emerging one by one, their low growls rumbling like distant thunder. The man raised his rifle, his heart pounding, but his hands steady. "You've picked the wrong fight," he muttered under his breath. Before the wolves could advance, the man fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the forest, causing the pack to pause. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Then the wolves began to move again, their hunger overriding their caution. The man prepared to fire again, but a sudden sound stopped him. The bobcat let out a deep guttural growl, its body low to the ground, its injured leg barely supporting its weight. The wolves hesitated, their eyes flicking between the man and the unexpected defiance of the injured creature. The man glanced at the bobcat, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you've got some fight left after all." The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, man and animal stood together, ready to face whatever the wilderness threw at them. The fire burned low in the cabin, casting dim, flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. The bobcat lay curled near the hearth, its golden eyes half closed but alert, ears twitching at the faint sounds of the forest outside. The man sat nearby, oiling the barrel of his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. He glanced occasionally at the window, where the moonlight filtered through frost-laden glass, illuminating the ever-present threat of the wilderness beyond. The wolves had not ventured closer since the night before, their howls now distant echoes among the trees. But the man knew they were still out there, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He set the rifle aside and rose, his boots creaking on the wooden floor as he moved toward the window. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, unbroken except for the scattered tracks of the wolves circling the cabin. "They're patient," he muttered, his breath fogging the cold glass. "Too patient." Behind him, the bobcat stirred, lifting its head to watch him. Its body, though still lean and scarred, had grown stronger in the days since he found it. The salves and food had done their work, and the animal now moved with more confidence, its instincts sharpening with each passing hour. The man turned back, his sharp gaze meeting the bobcat's. "You're getting restless, aren't you?" he said, his voice low. The bobcat's tail flicked, as if in response. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Can't say I blame you. This place wasn't meant to hold a spirit like yours." He crouched by the fire, stoking the flames until they flared brighter. The bobcat shifted closer, drawn to the warmth, but its eyes never left the man. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile truce forged in the crucible of survival. "You remind me of something," the man said after a moment, his voice softer. "When I first came out here, I thought I could tame this place. Thought I could bend it to my will, but it doesn't work like that, does it?" He chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "The wild doesn't break. It breaks you if you're not careful." The bobcat's gaze remained steady, its golden eyes reflecting the firelight. The man fell silent, lost in thought, until the faint crunch of snow outside snapped him back to the present. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, his body tense. Peering through the small window, he saw nothing but the dark silhouettes of trees. Still, the sound had been real, too deliberate to be the wind or settling snow. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his face as his boots sank into the snow. The clearing stretched out in eerie stillness, the moonlight painting the landscape in shades of silver and gray. The man scanned the tree line, his finger resting lightly on the rifle's trigger. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, followed by the faint rustle of movement. "They're testing us," he muttered under his breath. He turned back to the cabin, his senses on high alert. The wolves were getting bolder, their patience giving way to hunger. It was only a matter of time before they tried again. Inside, the bobcat had risen to its feet, its ears swiveling toward the same sounds. Its muscles were coiled, its body low to the ground, a predator's stance. The man closed the door behind him, bolting it securely before placing the rifle back on the table. "They'll come soon," he said, glancing at the bobcat, "but we'll be ready." The hours passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional pop of the fire and the distant calls of the wolves. The man busied himself checking his supplies, extra ammunition, a knife he kept strapped to his belt, and the makeshift traps he'd set around the clearing. The bobcat watched him intently, its instincts aligning with his preparations. By the time the first howl shattered the stillness, the man was ready. He extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the faint glow of the fire. Outside, the wolves emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming as they moved into the clearing. This time, there were more of them, 8, maybe 9, forming a loose circle around the cabin. The bobcat growled low in its throat, its body tense and ready. The man crouched by the window, his rifle steady as he watched the pack advance. The lead wolf, a massive gray with a scar across its muzzle, stepped forward, its growl rumbling like distant thunder.
"Hold steady,"
the man whispered, more to himself than to the bobcat. The wolves moved as one, closing the circle with calculated precision. The man fired a warning shot, the crack of the rifle splitting the air. The wolves paused but did not retreat. Instead, the lead wolf crouched, its muscles coiling as it prepared to lunge. Before the man could react, the bobcat sprang forward, its growl turning into a fierce snarl. It leaped onto the table, its claws scratching against the wood as it launched itself toward the window. The wolves hesitated, startled by the sudden defiance. The man took advantage of the moment, firing another shot that grazed the lead wolf's shoulder. The pack scattered briefly, their snarls turning into whines as they retreated to the edge of the clearing. The bobcat landed lightly on the floor, its gaze locked on the wolves outside. Its body was a blur of coiled energy, ready to strike if the wolves dared to approach again. The man lowered his rifle, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you're not done fighting," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. The wolves lingered at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes a constant reminder of the danger that still loomed. But for now, they kept their distance, wary of the combined strength of man and beast. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, its warmth a fragile barrier against the cold and the dark. The man and the bobcat exchanged a glance, their bond solidified by the unspoken promise of survival, whatever the wilderness might bring. The first light of dawn crept into the forest, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. The wolves had retreated with the fading night, their howls now distant echoes among the trees. The man stood at the cabin's window, his rifle resting against the wall, watching as the world slowly came back to life. Birds began to stir in the branches, their songs timid in the lingering chill, and the faint rustle of wind carried the promise of another harsh day. Behind him, the bobcat stretched languidly, its golden fur catching the morning light that filtered through the frost-covered panes. Though its movements were still slow, its strength was returning. It padded closer to the fire, curling around itself in a patch of warmth, but its sharp eyes followed the man's every move. The man turned, a faint smile breaking the tension in his weathered face. "You're looking better," he said quietly, grabbing a tin cup of lukewarm coffee from the table. "Stronger." He sipped the bitter brew, his gaze lingering on the animal. "Soon, you'll be back out there where you belong." The bobcat flicked its tail but didn't break eye contact. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. "Isamonti." A tentative understanding forged in the crucible of shared survival. The man set the cup down and pulled on his coat, the leather cracked and worn from years of exposure to the elements. "Time to check the traps," he muttered. He glanced at the bobcat, his voice softening. "You hold down the fort while I'm gone." Outside, the forest was still, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his way toward the perimeter of the clearing. He moved with practiced ease, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of movement. The traps he'd set were simple but effective. Snares for rabbits, a deadfall for anything larger. The fresh snowfall had covered the tracks of the wolves, but he knew they were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The first snare he checked was empty, the loop of wire buried in a drift of snow. The second held a rabbit, its body still and cold. The man crouched, his fingers working quickly to free the animal. "At least it's something," he murmured, placing the rabbit in the burlap sack slung over his shoulder. As he moved to the next trap, a series of tracks caught his attention. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, and unmistakably those of a wolf. His grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder, his body tense as his eyes scanned the tree line. The tracks led toward the edge of the clearing, where they mingled with others before disappearing into the dense underbrush. He knelt, studying the pattern. They had been circling closer, testing the boundaries of his territory. "They'll be back," he said under his breath. "Sooner than I'd like." He finished his rounds quickly, returning to the cabin with the rabbit and a bundle of firewood strapped to his back. As he approached, he saw the bobcat sitting by the window, its ears swiveling toward every sound. Its posture was alert, a reminder that it too was tuned to the rhythms of the wild. Inside, the man set down his haul, removing his coat and boots before stoking the fire. He skinned the rabbit with quick, precise movements, the blade of his knife flashing in the firelight. The bobcat watched intently, its nose quivering as the scent of fresh meat filled the air. "You've earned this," the man said, tossing a small piece of the meat toward the animal. The bobcat caught it with surprising agility, tearing into it with sharp teeth. It was a small victory, but it brought a faint smile to the man's face. The hours passed quietly, the routine of the day a comforting rhythm. The man repaired tools, checked the fortifications of the cabin, and prepared more salve for the bobcat's healing wound. The animal, though still cautious, moved more freely around the room, its steps no longer faltering. It explored the corners of the cabin, its sharp claws scratching lightly against the wooden floor as it tested its boundaries. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a dull gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. The man stood at the window, his brow furrowed as he watched the first flakes drift down. The storm would be bad. He could feel it in the tightening chill of the air. He turned back to the bobcat, which had settled near the fire, its eyes half closed but still alert.
We're in for another rough one, he said, his voice low. Better be ready.
As the storm rolled in, the man worked quickly to secure the cabin. He reinforced the door with an extra plank of wood and checked the traps he had set near the clearing to ensure they wouldn't be buried under the snow. The bobcat watched him, its gaze steady and unblinking, as if sensing the rising tension. Night fell, bringing with it the full force of the storm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling against the windows. The man sat near the fire, his rifle resting across his knees. The bobcat lay nearby, its body coiled and ready, its ears flicking toward every creak and groan of the cabin. It was close to midnight when the first sound reached them, a faint rustle, almost inaudible beneath the roar of the storm. The bobcat's head snapped up, its golden eyes fixed on the door. The man froze, his hand tightening on the rifle. The sound came again, louder this time, the crunch of snow under heavy paws. The man rose silently, his movements slow and deliberate. He motioned to the bobcat, as if the animal could understand his intent. The bobcat crouched low, its muscles tense, its sharp claws digging into the wooden floor. The wolves had returned, their hunger driving them to brave the storm. The man stepped toward the door, his heart pounding, as he prepared to face them once again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The bobcat, now stronger and more defiant, stood by his side, a living testament to the unbreakable will to survive. Together they waited, the storm raging around them, ready to confront whatever came next. The storm raged outside, howling winds battering the cabin as snow piled against its walls. Inside, the fire cast a flickering glow, illuminating the man and the bobcat as they stood side by side, their focus fixed on the door. The faint crunch of snow outside was unmistakable now, padded steps moving deliberately through the clearing. The wolves were here. The man tightened his grip on the rifle, his sharp eyes darting to the shuttered windows. The wolves were circling, their growls carried on the wind like a distant rumble of thunder. He crouched by the door, his breath steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Behind him, the bobcat crouched low, its golden eyes reflecting the firelight. Its body was taut, every muscle coiled in readiness. A heavy thud against the door snapped the man into action. He raised his rifle, aiming at the sound as his jaw tightened. Another thud, louder this time, shook the wooden frame. The wolves were testing the cabin's defenses, their hunger overriding their fear of the human scent.
They're desperate,
the man muttered under his breath.
Desperate makes them dangerous.
The bobcat growled low in its throat, its ears flat against its head. It had faced these predators before, and bore the scars to prove it. Now, with its strength returning, it was no longer the helpless creature the wolves had once circled. The door shook again, splinters flying from its edges as the wolves pressed harder. The man fired a shot through a narrow gap in the shutter, the crack of the rifle piercing the storm's howl. A yelp followed, then silence. He reloaded quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, but the silence didn't last. The wolves regrouped, their growls rising in a chorus of defiance. One of them howled, the sound long and mournful, and it sent a shiver through the man despite his resolve. They weren't retreating, not this time. The bobcat paced behind him, its tail lashing as its instincts flared. The man glanced back, a faint smile breaking his tense expression. "You ready for this?" he said softly. The bobcat didn't respond, of course, but its stance said everything he needed to know. Suddenly, the wolves struck again, this time attacking in unison. The door shuddered violently, and the sound of claws scraping against the wood filled the cabin. The man fired another shot, then another, driving the pack back momentarily, but he knew they wouldn't stop. With a deep breath, he moved to the small window, unbolting the shutter just enough to peer out. Snow whipped against his face as he caught a glimpse of the pack. There were 7 of them, their forms ghost-like in the swirling storm. The alpha, a massive gray with piercing yellow eyes, stood at the forefront, its muzzle streaked with frost. It locked eyes with the man, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The alpha lunged. The man fired again, the bullet grazing the wolf's flank. It yelped, but didn't retreat, its resolve unbroken. The pack closed ranks, advancing toward the cabin with a terrifying unity. "They're not giving up," the man muttered, stepping back from the window. He turned to the bobcat, which had taken up a position near the door. "Looks like we're in this together." The next assault came fast. The wolves threw their weight against the door, the hinges groaning under the strain. The man fired through the wood, his shots precise but limited. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Then, with a crash, the door burst inward. The lead wolf lunged, its yellow eyes blazing as it charged into the cabin. The man fired, the shot grazing its shoulder, but the alpha didn't falter. Before the wolf could reach him, the bobcat sprang into action. With a snarl that echoed through the small room, the bobcat leaped onto the wolf, its claws raking across the predator's face. The wolf yelped, snapping its jaws in a desperate attempt to shake off its attacker. The bobcat was relentless, its movements swift and feral as it drove the wolf back toward the door. The man fired again, striking one of the wolves that had entered behind the alpha. It crumpled to the ground, its packmates hesitating for a fraction of a second. The bobcat seized the moment, landing a final blow that sent the alpha retreating with a whine. Blood streaked the snow as the wolf limped back into the storm, its pack following reluctantly. The cabin fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the man's heavy breathing. He lowered the rifle, his hands trembling slightly from the intensity of the fight. The bobcat stood near the door, its golden eyes scanning the clearing through the open frame. Blood matted its fur, but it stood tall, its body radiating defiance. The man stepped forward cautiously, his voice soft. "You all right, boy?" The bobcat turned its head, meeting his gaze. For the first time, there was no wariness in its eyes, only an unspoken understanding, a bond forged in the heat of battle. The storm began to ease, the wind dying down as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The wolves were gone, their tracks disappearing into the snow. The man closed the door, bracing it with what remained of the barricade, and turned to the bobcat. "You saved us tonight," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Didn't think I'd see that day." The bobcat didn't move, its sharp gaze fixed on the fire, but as the man stoked the flames, adding another log to the fire, the animal settled down near the hearth, its body relaxing for the first time in hours. Together they sat in the quiet aftermath, the storm fading into memory. For now, they had survived. But in the wilderness, peace was always fleeting, and they both knew the fight was far from over. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold, the sun casting sharp rays through the trees, glinting off the snow that blanketed the forest floor. The cabin stood quiet, its walls bearing the marks of the previous night's battle. The makeshift barricade at the door had held just long enough, though the scratches gouged into the wood told a tale of how close it had been. Inside, the man moved with a careful determination, his steps deliberate as he began repairing the damage. The bobcat lay near the fire, its body still but its ears swiveling at every creak of the floorboards or distant rustle of wind. It had earned this rest, its wounds from the fight minor compared to what they could have been. The man paused to look at the animal, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You've got more guts than most folks I know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I owe you one." The bobcat's gaze shifted to him briefly before it closed its eyes again, as if dismissing the remark. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head as he returned to his work. He patched the door with extra planks, layering them over the jagged edges where the wolves had broken through. Every now and then, he glanced at the window, his rifle never out of reach. The wolves might be gone, but he knew better than to think the danger had passed completely. Once the repairs were finished, the man gathered his supplies, a small pack of provisions, the last few rounds of ammunition, and his hunting knife. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and turned to the Bobcat, which had risen to a seated position, its golden eyes following his every move. "I need to check the traps," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Won't be gone long." The Bobcat tilted its head slightly, its ears twitching as the man opened the door. The cold hit him like a slap, the air crisp and sharp against his skin. He stepped out, boots crunching on the snow, and took a deep breath, his breath visible in the icy air. The clearing was quiet, the tracks of the wolves from the night before now faint impressions beneath a layer of fresh snow. He scanned the tree line, his sharp eyes looking for any sign of movement, but the forest seemed still, too still. The man started toward the first trap, his senses heightened. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years navigating the wilderness, every step deliberate and quiet. The first snare was empty, its wire loop still intact. The second held a rabbit, its body frozen and stiff. He freed it quickly, slipping it into the burlap sack he carried. As he approached the third trap, he noticed tracks in the snow, fresh ones, smaller than those of the wolves but distinct. The furrows were deep, with a sharp drag that indicated something had been limping. He crouched, running his gloved fingers over the tracks, his brow furrowing. "Deer?" he muttered, studying the spacing of the prints. But something about them seemed off, too small, too deliberate. He stood scanning the forest for any sign of the animal. Whatever it was, it had passed through recently, its trail leading deeper into the trees. A faint sound caught his attention, the soft crunch of snow, barely audible. He turned sharply, his rifle coming up instinctively, but he saw nothing. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the underbrush, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. "Could be nothing," he murmured, though he didn't believe it. He continued toward the cabin, his pace quicker now, the weight of unease settling in his chest. By the time he reached the clearing, the Bobcat was standing at the door, its body tense, ears swiveling toward the trees. It let out a low growl as the man approached, its sharp gaze fixed on the tree line behind him. "You see something?" the man asked, stepping inside and bolting the door behind him. He set the sack down near the fire, his hand resting on the rifle. The Bobcat didn't relax, its growl rising in intensity as it backed away from the door. The man frowned, his own instincts kicking in. He moved to the window, peering out into the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the Bobcat's reaction wasn't something he could ignore. "You've got sharper senses than me," he admitted, stepping back. "If something's out there, I'll take your word for it." The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. The Bobcat remained alert, pacing the cabin and growling at intervals, its eyes darting to the windows and door. The man kept his rifle close, his gaze frequently shifting to the tree line outside. The stillness of the forest felt heavy, oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. By nightfall, the tension had only grown. The man lit the fire and placed another log on the flames, the crackling wood a small comfort against the unease that gripped him. The Bobcat sat near the door, its body rigid, its ears twitching at every sound. The first howl came just as the last light of day faded. It was distant but distinct, cutting through the silence like a blade. The man stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. A second howl followed, closer this time, then a third. The Bobcat rose, its tail lashing as it paced near the fire. The man stood, his jaw tightening. "They're testing us again," he said, his voice low. "But we're ready this time." The wolves were back. And this time, the man and the Bobcat both knew they wouldn't leave without a fight. The forest plunged into darkness, the last remnants of daylight swallowed by the encroaching night. Outside the cabin, the wolves had gathered, their howls rising in a discordant symphony that echoed through the snow-laden trees. Inside, the man and the Bobcat stood ready. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its warmth doing little to chase away the cold dread that crept through the room. The man moved to the window, peering out into the clearing. The faint glow of moonlight illuminated the snow, revealing shadows that shifted and moved with predatory intent. He could see their forms now, lean, powerful bodies weaving through the trees, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. The pack was larger this time. They had brought reinforcements, their desperation driving them to risk everything. "They're not just hunting tonight," the man muttered, his voice low and grim. "They're waging a war." Behind him, the Bobcat growled, its sharp eyes fixed on the door. It crouched low, every muscle tense, ready to spring at the first sign of movement. Its wound, though not fully healed, no longer seemed to hinder it. The animal's strength had returned, and with it, a ferocity that rivaled the wolves circling outside. The man tightened his grip on the rifle, his breath steady despite the tension in the air. He'd fortified the cabin as best he could. Planks reinforced the windows, and the door was braced with heavy wooden beams. Traps surrounded the perimeter, their placement carefully calculated, but he knew the wolves wouldn't back down easily. They had tasted the challenge, and now they were determined to win. The first attack came suddenly, a blur of movement against the snow. A wolf darted from the shadows, throwing itself against the door with a thud that shook the cabin. The man spun toward the sound, raising the rifle as another wolf struck one of the shuttered windows, its claws scraping against the wood. "They're testing us," he muttered, aiming toward the window. A shot rang out, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The wolf yelped and vanished into the shadows, but its retreat was temporary. The pack was emboldened, their howls growing louder, more frenzied. The bobcat paced near the door, its growl deep and guttural. It moved with purpose, as if it understood the stakes of the fight. The man glanced at the animal, a faint smile breaking through his grim expression.
"We're outnumbered," he said,
his voice steady,
"but not outmatched."
The wolves attacked again, this time in unison. The door shuddered under the force of their weight, the wooden beams groaning as claws and teeth tore at its edges. The man fired through the narrow gap at the top, his shots precise. A wolf fell back, blood staining the snow, but the others pressed on. Inside, the bobcat darted toward the window, leaping onto the sill as another wolf struck the shutter. With a snarl, it lashed out, its claws raking through the narrow slats and catching the predator's muzzle. The wolf yelped, scrambling back into the dark, but the bobcat didn't relent. It stayed on the sill, its golden eyes blazing, daring the pack to come closer. The man reloaded quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos. He moved between the door and the windows, firing at the wolves that dared to break the perimeter. Each shot bought them moments of reprieve, but he knew the pack's persistence would outlast his ammunition. As the wolves regrouped, a chilling silence fell over the clearing. The man froze, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. The bobcat growled low, its ears swiveling toward the door. The tension was suffocating, the quiet more unnerving than the howls had been. Then came the alpha. It stepped into the clearing with a slow, deliberate gait, its massive frame illuminated by the faint moonlight. Scars crisscrossed its gray coat, and its yellow eyes burned with intelligence and rage. The pack parted to let it through, their growls fading into an expectant hush. The alpha paused, its gaze locking onto the cabin, and let out a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver through the man's spine. The attack was immediate. The alpha lunged at the door, its powerful body slamming into the wood with enough force to splinter the frame. The pack followed, their combined weight crashing against the cabin in waves. The man fired repeatedly, each shot driving the wolves back, but failing to break their momentum. The door buckled under the assault, the beams groaning as the wolves pressed harder. The bobcat sprang into action. It launched itself toward the door, its claws striking through the gaps in the wood. A wolf yelped as the bobcat's claws found their mark, and the alpha turned its attention to the animal. With a snarl, it lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from the bobcat's face. The man moved quickly, firing at the alpha's flank. The shot hit its mark, the bullet grazing the wolf's side, but the alpha didn't retreat. It turned on the man, its yellow eyes blazing with fury, and charged. The man fired again, the shot grazing its leg, but the wolf was relentless. Before the alpha could reach him, the bobcat struck. It leaped onto the wolf's back, its claws sinking deep into its fur. The alpha snarled, twisting violently, but the bobcat held firm. It raked its claws down the wolf's side, its feral snarl echoing through the cabin. The pack faltered. The sight of their leader brought low by the defiant bobcat broke their resolve. One by one, the wolves retreated, their howls fading into the distance as they disappeared into the shadows. The alpha struggled beneath the bobcat's weight, its growls turning to whimpers as the fight left its body. The bobcat finally released it, stepping back with a triumphant snarl as the alpha limped away, vanishing into the dark. The cabin fell silent, the only sound the man's ragged breathing. He lowered the rifle, his hands trembling as he stared at the bobcat, its golden eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. Blood matted its fur, but it stood tall, its body radiating strength and defiance.
"You did it,"
the man said softly, his voice filled with awe.
"You drove them off!"
The bobcat didn't move, its gaze shifting to the door as if daring the wolves to return. But the clearing was empty now. The pack scattered, their attack repelled. For the first time in days, the man felt the weight of the wilderness lift, if only slightly. They had survived the night, but both man and bobcat knew the battle wasn't just about survival. It was about claiming their place in a world that offered no mercy. The dawn broke over the forest, pale light spilling through the trees and casting long shadows over the clearing. Snow covered the ground, bearing the marks of the struggle from the night before. Deep furrows where the wolves had circled, splatters of blood where the battle had been fiercest. The air was heavy with silence, a stark contrast to the chaos that had gripped the cabin only hours earlier. Inside, the man sat at the table, his rifle resting beside him. His hands moved deftly, cleaning the weapon as his sharp eyes flicked occasionally toward the door. The barricade held strong, reinforced again after the wolves' retreat, though it now bore the scars of the relentless assault. The bobcat lay near the fire, its golden fur streaked with dried blood, but its breathing steady. It licked at its wounds, each movement deliberate, its sharp eyes darting to the door with every creak of the cabin. The animal had earned its place here, its defiance against the pack a testament to its resilience. Yet, as much as it had proven its strength, there was a restlessness in its posture, a longing for the freedom of the wild. The man glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for," he said softly. The bobcat flicked its ears but didn't look at him, focused on cleaning its paw. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You don't survive out there without a fight." He set the rifle aside and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the small window. The forest stretched out beyond the frost-covered glass, quiet and still. The wolves were gone, at least for now, but their absence brought little comfort. The wilderness was unpredictable, always waiting to test those who dared to call it home. The day passed in uneasy quiet. The man worked to fortify the cabin further, dragging heavier beams to brace the door and checking the traps around the clearing. He returned with a small rabbit, its lifeless form a reminder of how fragile survival could be. Inside, the bobcat ate the scraps he offered, its movements more fluid than before, its strength steadily returning. By mid-afternoon, the man noticed a change in the bobcat. It paced near the door, its ears swiveling toward the forest as if listening to a call only it could hear. Its sharp claws scratched lightly at the wood, its body tense with a restless energy that hadn't been there the day before. "You're ready to go, aren't you?" the man said, his voice quiet but certain. He set down the knife he'd been sharpening and moved closer, crouching a few feet from the animal. The bobcat turned its golden eyes to him, its gaze steady and unyielding. The man sighed, his expression softening. "I knew this day would come. You're not meant to stay here, not forever." He rose slowly, moving to the door. His fingers lingered on the lock as he hesitated, a pang of reluctance tightening in his chest. For days, the bobcat had been his companion in this isolated, unforgiving place. It had been more than just an animal. It had been a reminder of resilience, a symbol of survival, in a world that offered no kindness. But it didn't belong here. Its place was out there, in the wild, where it could roam free and reclaim the life that had nearly been taken from it. The man unbolted the door and stepped aside, his hand resting on the frame as he looked at the bobcat. "Go on," he said, his voice steady despite the weight in his words. "The forest is calling." The bobcat hesitated, its sharp gaze flicking between the open door and the man. For a moment, it stayed still, its body coiled as if uncertain. Then, with a quiet grace, it rose and padded toward the threshold. It paused there, its golden eyes meeting the man's one last time. "Take care of yourself out there," he said softly. "You've got what it takes." The bobcat didn't linger. It stepped into the clearing, its movements fluid and deliberate, the scars on its body a testament to the battles it had fought and won. The man watched as it disappeared into the trees, its sleek form vanishing like a shadow into the wilderness. The cabin felt emptier without it. The man closed the door, bolting it against the cold as he returned to his seat by the fire. The silence pressed down on him, but it wasn't the oppressive stillness of before. It was different now, lighter, as though the presence of the bobcat had left something behind, an indelible mark on the man's solitary life. Outside, the forest carried on, its rhythms unbroken by the struggles of those who lived within it. The wolves would return someday, the storms would rage, and the trials of survival would continue. But for now, the clearing was quiet, the sun casting golden light through the trees. The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the window. Somewhere out there, the bobcat was running free, its spirit untamed. He smiled faintly, a sense of peace settling over him. The wild had tested them both, and they had proven their strength. In the end, that was enough. The forest was quiet, blanketed in the soft light of dawn. Snow sparkled like frost-covered diamonds, untouched and pure, save for the faint tracks leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the dense woods. The bobcat's trail was already fading, covered by the gentle drift of new snow. The man stood in the clearing, his breath visible in the crisp air, his sharp eyes fixed on the point where the tracks vanished among the trees. It had been hours since the bobcat left, its golden form slipping silently into the wild. Yet the echoes of its presence lingered in the cabin, in the rhythm of the man's solitary day. He returned to the door, running a hand over the scars the wolves had left on its wooden surface. Each mark told a story of defiance, of survival against all odds. The fire crackled softly as he stepped back inside, setting his rifle against the wall. The cabin felt still, almost too quiet, as though it too noticed the absence of the wild creature that had shared its space. The man moved through his morning routine with deliberate care, boiling water, patching gear, and tending to the traps. Yet his thoughts kept drifting to the bobcat. He hadn't expected it to leave so soon. But then again, creatures like that didn't linger where they didn't belong. The wilderness called them back, its pull stronger than any bond forged by circumstance. Still, something about the animal's departure stirred an ache he couldn't quite name. Outside, the forest began to wake. Birds flitted through the branches, their songs piercing the cold air. A faint rustle in the underbrush signaled the scurry of small prey. Life carried on as it always did, indifferent to the struggles and triumphs of those who passed through it. The man set out to check the traps, his boots crunching through the snow. His sharp gaze swept the trees, alert for any movement. The wolf pack hadn't returned, their defeat likely driving them deeper into the forest to regroup. But their absence didn't ease his vigilance. The wilderness was full of dangers, each as unpredictable as the shifting weather. The first snare held a rabbit, its body still and cold. The man crouched, freeing the animal with a practiced efficiency. He moved on to the next trap, his steps careful, his rifle ready. Each trap yielded small returns, enough to sustain him, but little more. He worked quickly, his mind still turning over the events of the past week. And when he reached the clearing nearest the creek, something caught his eye. Tracks, deep, deliberate prints pressed into the snow. They were fresh, leading to the water's edge and then vanishing. His brow furrowed as he knelt, running a gloved hand over the markings. Bobcat tracks! The realization made him pause. He looked toward the dense trees, scanning for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still. The tracks weren't far from the cabin, a sign that the bobcat hadn't gone far. It was unusual for a creature to linger so close to where it had been nursed back to health, yet here was proof. "You're keeping an eye on me," he muttered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He rose, following the tracks to the creek. They stopped at the water's edge, the faint imprint of a paw pressed into the ice. Beyond that, there was nothing, only the smooth, unbroken expanse of snow stretching into the trees. The bobcat was gone again, its path swallowed by the wilderness. The man lingered for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, before turning back toward the cabin. He carried the rabbits he'd caught and some fallen branches for the fire, his steps slower than usual. The sight of the tracks had stirred something, a quiet hope that, even in the solitude of his life, connections could leave echoes. By the time he returned, the sun was high, casting golden light across the clearing. He set the firewood beside the cabin and stepped inside, the warmth of the hearth greeting him like an old friend. He skinned the rabbits, hung the pelts to dry, and prepared a stew over the fire. The rhythmic tasks of survival filled the space, grounding him in the present. As the day faded into evening, the man sat by the window, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily from a steel-gray sky. He sipped from a tin cup, the warmth of the drink chasing away the chill. In the distance, a shadow moved. The man stiffened, his sharp eyes narrowing as he peered through the frost-covered glass. For a moment, he thought it might be a wolf, its lean form weaving between the trees, but as it stepped into the clearing, he recognized the fluid, deliberate movements. The bobcat. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, its golden fur blending with the pale light of the snow. Its ears flicked forward, its sharp eyes scanning the cabin. The man didn't move, his breath caught in his chest. The animal stood there for what felt like an eternity, its tail flicking once before it turned and disappeared into the trees. The man leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at his lips. The bobcat was out there, wild and free, but its presence was still tangible, a thread connecting their lives, however briefly they had crossed. The fire crackled softly, its warmth spreading through the cabin. The man closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the forest lull him into a rare peace. The wolves would return one day, and the storms would rage, but for now, the wilderness was quiet. And somewhere in that vast, untamed world, the bobcat roamed, a testament to resilience, freedom, and the unyielding will to survive. The man raised his tin cup in a quiet toast to the unseen figure in the wild. "Stay strong out there," he said softly, the words barely more than a whisper. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the tracks of the past and paving the way for what lay ahead.